And at the same time, in order to summon the audience that one needs to even survive, a publisher must pander to the algorithmic demands of Facebook and Google. So there's a constant anxiety. Are we reading Facebook and Google properly so that our content shows up in front of people's eyes at the right moments? And therefore, what must we do to make ourselves more attractive to Facebook and Google's algorithms? At the same time, Facebook and Google are taking away all the advertising they would have earned anyway. So it's like these publications are constantly making design and editorial decisions to feed the very beasts that are starving them. And it's a really vicious cycle, one that no one has yet come up with a bold enough response to.
A few years back, I found myself talking to a police person from Hong Kong who'd been engaged with policing pirate TV, which is why that example comes to mind. And he made the point that it's no longer the case even that the digital files that they're trying to police are definitively in some other country. They're in no country. They're sort of split up in different sectors that are in different jurisdictions completely. So there's no, it's not like he can go to his corresponding person in the Philippines, say, and say, can you go and raid this plant? Because there is no such place. You have to, you find yourself having to deal with something that is simply incommensurable with the world of jurisdictional policing.
It's increasingly evident that this advertising-funded, bundled product of the newspaper, where sports cross-subsidizes foreign reporting, is problematic now. And I think it's time for us to think about what journalism is and what its role is, and to start thinking about possibilities that have been anathema for a long time. In this country, there's a tradition of avoiding the discussion of state funding, because somehow state-funded journalism would be somehow in contradiction with the First Amendment, or it would somehow, the state could not be trusted to police itself, and so on. So that's unlikely. We're unlikely to have kind of state-funded journalism. But there are other areas where, in fact, there are, in history, you can look at all the subsidies that went to newspapers in the earlier period that I've studied, like the post office subsidy. And in Britain, of course, you have the tradition of the BBC. So we can't ignore that possibility. And we could think about big benefactors, the sort of Jeff Bezoses of the world, saving newspapers. But I think that's not a sustainable answer to the question either. It may help in the short term and so on, but there may be other kinds of foundations that could be set up. There's that could have more wider participation. There's a French scholar, economist named Julia Cagé, who's written a book in French. I would translate it sort of saving the media or saving journalism. And she proposes different kinds of funding structures. And one of them is a kind of foundation structure where there would be crowdfunding participation. But not just I'm going to give donations like I occasionally do to Wikipedia, but by giving donations, I'm also going to have a voting right in this organization. And that you could actually, she's an economist, so she talks about the different ways that you could set this up so that the largest donors don't automatically have the most control as they would in a shareholding corporation. But it would be a kind of not-for-profit foundation that would be funded through a larger participation and could have a kind of a way to perpetuate itself and not be interested in generating dividends for shareholders.
Instead of asking, like a journalism school would, how do we save journalism as it has been practiced and funded for 100 years or 200 years, we ask, what do citizens need to operate in an informed and responsible way going forward? What sort of norms and regulations and platforms and technologies, habits of mind and sources of information do citizens need to engage?
Abstracting out from what we all know universities to be to what problem universities are fundamentally trying to solve. They're trying to solve the problem of how do we make sure research occurs that is valuable to society, that isn't sustainable under capitalism, that isn't self-funding under capitalism? How do we make that operate? And simultaneously, how do we protect research that gives us answers that people don't want to hear? How do we protect the researcher who comes back with a finding that is against the interests of industry, against the interests of government, against the interests of an advertiser? And so the systems, the systems that we have in place in a university, including the tenure system, fundamentally abstracting that away from what universities generally study and what they produce, that they produce academic monographs and articles. The system is, you have a researcher, the researcher produces a bunch of good material, some funding body judges, yes, this person is producing good material. The person says, I want to continue producing this material. The funding body says, okay, we will give you tenure and a permanent line of funding. Go forth into the world and produce this material. And you can imagine that existing for journalists.
I wanted to propose a slightly different account of how we got here, which really involves that at the end of the 30 years following the war, we elected politicians who stopped enforcing antitrust law. And so one of the things that happened was that newsrooms became horribly weakened monotonically year after year, regardless of what was happening in technology, right? It wasn't Google who caused all of the little family-owned newspapers to become giant chains who consolidated all of their news gathering in centralized newsrooms with centralized ad sales departments. It was Google who moved into that weakened environment where those firms had already been harmed and started to take those weak entities and to kill them off. But the reason they were weak is because of lax antitrust enforcement. And the reason Google got so strong is because of lax antitrust enforcement. And the reason that market ideology is commanding so much of our public discourse and requiring academics to argue over and over again for the value of pursuing knowledge that is not of immediate corporate use is also lax antitrust enforcement. And that we have these three things that are effects, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out which one of them is the cause.
Every funding source is hackable, just as every way of setting up a government is hackable, right? And they all have failure modes. And democracy is hackable and has a failure mode. And monarchy is hackable and has a failure mode. And aristocracy is hackable and has a failure mode. And the insane Florentine Renaissance system of picking citizens at random out of a bag and making them be in charge of the state for 2 to 3 months at a time arbitrarily while locked in a tower, I kid you not, was hackable. All systems are hackable. But if you diversify the number of different things, they aren't all hackable by the same failure condition. So if you have your journalism all be funded by advertising, then something that makes the advertising revenue be undermined will undermine your whole journal. But if your journal has subscribers and advertising and people who pay $1 a week to have the crossword puzzle one day in advance, and sells anthologies of the cartoons that it runs and gets some of the money from that, and has 2 or 3 other funding models, and has a donor who makes it be a foundation, then even when the donor becomes corrupt and terrible, the other revenue streams are still there. So following the same principle that the founders of the American experiment took from Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, of the idea of having division of government, so that there are different branches and the different branches have different hackabilities, different failure modes. So similarly, as we think about funding something important, whether that thing is a university or whether that thing is journalism, if we can diversify the funding streams, it becomes buffered against the different historical circumstances and political pressures that can trigger the failure mode of any one of those funding streams.